Dr. Dunn.
When you've been at it 100 years, you can get a lot done. We're glad you're here. And again, remind you of questions in approximately 30 minutes. You don't have to agree with us. You can be antagonistic in your philosophy. But as indicated, we will try to respect each other. We're talking this evening about the question, what is creation science? I think that's absolutely essential because it is so wickedly, that's not always the case, sometimes ignorantly, misrepresented in the media. And if your knowledge has come from what you've read in most of the newspapers or seen reported, you probably don't have a clue. And I think that will become obvious as we proceed this evening. There seems to be a boilerplate set of statements that have to be inserted anytime somebody mentions creation science. Here's what it is. That's not what it is. We're going to talk about what it is this evening. We'll begin with a statement from the Supreme Court by the late Justice Rehnquist and Justice Scalia, as they dissent from the majority decision in the Edwards versus Willard case. We'll look at the majority opinion as well. But the issue was, what is creation science? They were talking about our subject, and some were trying to say this was religion. And they pointed out that dozens, literally dozens of scientists had testified during the trial. And they said, we have no basis on the record to conclude that creation science need be anything other than a collection of scientific data supporting the theory that life abruptly appeared on the earth. That's what it is. Scientific data supporting the idea that life abruptly appeared. That's what you read in the newspaper, right? I don't think so. But this is what the Supreme Court justices have documented for us. Some would say, okay, but how do you look at scientific data and tell the difference between creation and evolution? Well, let's consider that. And as we look at empirical evidence, considering origins, we look at a rock, and how did this form? Well, that probably happens naturally. Looks like a regular rock. On the other hand, when we look at this rock, do you think that happened naturally? I don't think so. This is an indication of creation design. Now, having reached the conclusion that it was designed, does that mean, okay, you can't have this in the science classroom, you must have that in the Sunday school classroom? Does that make sense? This is what we're being told. If you reach the conclusion of creative design, this has to be religious. If you look at the rock and you see this has to be designed. You walk down the beach and you see these radiations that parallel the water. What caused that? What's the explanation? Was it natural or was it designed? You see them appear and disappear with the tides. You get a pretty good idea that the waves are doing this. But you walk further down the beach and you see John loves Mary. Must have been done by the waves. You think? No. You obviously reach the conclusion that one is designed and that one is natural, and now then you're engaged in religious. And you can't do this in the classroom. I think that's just nuts. Makes no sense at all. You can look at the empirical evidence and distinguish the difference between creation and design. We do that every day. And when you look at the empirical evidence in the world around us, there is abundant empirical evidence for design. William Paley made this point. over 100 years ago in Paley's natural theology, what's implied about from the universe and from what we see in the world. He said he's walking down on the beach and you see a watch, and what's the conclusion here? Doesn't that necessarily infer a watchmaker? And that influenced a lot of people, though people now have said that's not a good argument, because it applies to natural things, but not to biology. And why doesn't the same principle apply? I think we find exactly the same kind of evidence in biology. We noticed, for example, in the journal Science, just a few years ago, talking about the daily cycles in cyanobacteria. Somehow they know what time it is, and every day at the same time they do their thing. They've got an internal clock, and it describes the biochemical machinery. This is the terminology in science. Biochemical machinery, a ratcheting mechanism by which the oscillator ticks unidirectionally. Sounds like a watch, doesn't it? It has cogs, it has gears. This system reveals the molecular mechanisms of biological timekeeping. How does it know what time it is? Well, it's got a clock. It's got cogs and gears. Now, when Paley finds that on the beach, that means there has to be a watchmaker. When you find the same thing in biology, don't we have indication of design by the same logic? And why does it make sense one place and not the other? There is, you can see Paley's clock right there in the bacteria. And more we're seeing evidence of this kind of thing. Here from Live Science, 2013, a creature with interlocking gears. And this is a microscopic view, but this is what you see in your watch. This is what you see in all kinds of machinery. Car engines, which just happen by themselves. You talk to an engineer, they'll tell you right quick. If it works, you've got an engineer behind it. And that's logic. That's what we observe. One of the most obvious examples is the little tail in the bacteria, the bacterial flagellum. This is an outboard motor that allows the bacteria to propel itself through a liquid medium. This motor has a rotor, just like an electric motor does. It has a stator, it has O-rings, it has bushings, a U-joint, drive shaft. This is a motor. It turns at 100,000 revolutions per minute. You know, like your automobile engine. What would happen if you revved up the automobile engine to 100,000 revolutions? You would have a million pieces. This thing works better than any motor that we've been able to manufacture. It has a network controlled clutch and brakes. It has over 30 functioning parts that all are interdependent, dependent on each other. So that if you're missing one, the whole thing quits. If the rotor goes out, you're through. Now, Darwin talked about developing things step by step gradually. In fact, he says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. You can't do this step by step. You've got to have the whole, or nothing works. Each is interdependent on the other part. And so when you look at machinery like this, we know what happens, how we get machinery. You've got to have engineers that design it. That's what science is about, what we observe, and that is what we observe. We can look at the natural world and distinguish between the natural and the designed, and here is a demonstration, and we see many of them. Now, part of the boilerplate that we hear as creation science is misrepresented always involved, well, this is the God of the galaxy. I just can't imagine how this could happen by itself, and my failure of imagination in its argument for God, that's not the argument that we're making. I think there's some implication there. It's so awesome, it just doesn't make sense that it developed. But that's not the point. What we're saying is that machinery, by observation, comes about as a result of design. Observation demonstrates that machines are designed. And therefore, when we see machinery, design is the scientific explanation. Now that's the argument, and that's different. But this is unanswerable in terms of what we know about science today. Observation says that machines are designed. We see machines throughout the universe, through biological systems. Therefore, the scientific explanation is design. And it's amazing that many of the anti-creationists will acknowledge this. Richard Dawkins is one of the most vicious anti-creationists in the world, from Oxford. He says in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, from that title you can see what he believes in. He says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now, don't be fooled by that, he says. That's not the way it is. It happened by this blind watchmaker of chance. But it looks designed. Well, I think maybe it would be more reasonable to go with what it looks like, which is the way we're supposed to do it in science. But he sees the point, and that's the way he defines biology. Francis Crick, Nobel laureate, who describer of DNA, made this comment: biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed. I mean, it looks that way, but you got to remind yourself. Keep in mind it wasn't designed, rather it wasn't. In other words, keep your blinders on. You only are allowed to look in this direction. It may look like something over here is reasonable, but no, you can't look that way. I don't think that makes for good science. And thus, in our classrooms, arguments that would clearly indicate machinery by a designer are not allowed. They're disallowed in the class. No intelligence allowed in the classroom, if you will, in terms of design. Now, I believe that both evolution and creation can be investigated scientifically, and I believe we can demonstrate that. And any reasonable person can see that. Of course, both of them do have profound religious implications. So often we hear, well, one is religious and one is scientific. Therefore, one's in the classroom and one can't be. It's a very naive statement. Both of them can be investigated scientifically, which we've shown. Both of them have profound religious implications. Evolution, religious implications, absolutely. Let me give you an illustration from Richard Dawkins himself. Let him describe the implications.
And a lawyer said, Dr. Dawkins, has your belief in evolution, has your study of evolution turned you towards atheism? I would have to say yes.
And yet we're told there's no religious implication. Well, this
particular point that, or something that you read or an experience you had that sort of said, yeah, this is it. God doesn't exist.
Oh, well, by far the most important, I suppose, was understanding evolution. I think the evangelical Christians have really sort of got it right in the way in seeing evolution as the enemy, whereas the more, what shall we say, sophisticated theologians who are quite happy to live with evolution, I think they're deluded. I think the evangelicals have got it right in that there really is a deep incompatibility between evolution and Christianity, and I think I realized that at the age of about 16.
It's extremely naive to deny the religious implications of evolution, and Dawkins helps emphasize that. Notice the statement by Isaac Asimov, a very famous atheist, recently passed away. I'd say he's no longer an atheist, but that's my view. Here he says, I have faith and believe myself I believe that nothing beyond those natural laws is needed. That's his faith. I have no evidence for this. It is simply what I have faith in and what I believe. So this is a blind. He's chosen to be a naturalist. And this is a religious conviction that he holds and won't budge. Some people choose to be Catholics or Methodists or Presbyterians. He chooses to be a naturalist with blind faith and believes it. This is a religious position. Even the Supreme Court has ruled that it is religious. But just thinking about what they have to believe, it's unbelievable to see what an unbeliever has to believe to be an unbeliever. That nothing created everything. That a big explosion produced all of the order in the universe. I've all seen that kind of thing happen. In spite of what we see. The molecules self-assemble and become living cells, and that errors in a complex information system produce more information. This is blind faith. The unbeliever believes that there was nothing, and then nothing happened to nothing, and then nothing magically exploded, created everything. And a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason into self-replicating parts and turned into dinosaurs and eventually into people. That is a lot of faith. I don't have that much faith. I don't have that kind of faith. I want evidence. I want to know why. And I think creationists and scientists and good scientists all need to ask that question rather than relying on their own faith, on religion that they cannot defend with evidence. Nevertheless, our tax dollars are supporting humanistic naturalism to the exclusion of alternatives, which is propaganda. You don't allow the alternatives to show alternative views. And we're paying for that. And I object. I don't think that's appropriate. I think good science demands all of the evidence. And we're talking about the scientific data. Not talking about Genesis. We're talking about the scientific evidence. But some people will say, okay, I understand what you're saying, but isn't it illegal to do anything else but teach evolution? And that simply is not true. Some school systems seem to think that's true, and the press would seem to leave that impression, but it isn't true. Back to that same Supreme Court decision, quoting this time from Brennan's opinion, who gave the majority opinion, the reason he overturned it, and the act said in Louisiana, you have to teach both. If you teach one view, you have to teach the other. Anytime you teach evolution, you have to teach the scientific evidence for the opposing view to be fair and balanced. It was called the balanced treatment act. Yeah, but we can't have that. That was overturned. But the reason it was overturned is that the act did not grant teachers the flexibility they did not already possess to supplant the present science curriculum with a presentation of theories besides evolution about the origin of life. You already have the right to present alternative views, and that's why you don't need this act. Teaching a variety of scientific theories about origins of humankind to school children might be validly done with the clear secular intent of enhancing the effectiveness of science education. You can't teach Genesis in the science classroom, but you can teach an alternative view to evolution with scientific evidence. Validly done. There really is only one alternative. Either it happens suddenly and complexly, or it happens gradually and naturally and slowly. Stephen Gould is one of the more famous evolutionists in our country. He passed away just recently. He was interviewed immediately after this decision was handed down. The press said creation science has been outlawed, which wasn't the case at all. In fact, it was just the opposite. It can be validly done with clear secular intent. But requiring it was overturned. He says in the interview, no statute exists in any state to bar instruction in creation science. It could be taught before, it can be taught now. And that is still the case with the clear secular intent. And that's all we're asking for and arguing for. But in spite of the propaganda that it's illegal and that it's all about two naked people in the garden running around talking to snakes, in spite of the deceitful propaganda, it's amazing that we're obviously winning the battle, and rather dramatically. Looking at a recent poll published in Live Science, this was just last year, according to the new Gallup poll, 42% espoused the creationist view, 31% said God-guided evolution, 19% believed what is taught in the schools, that it operated without God. We have the majority opinion in this case. Zogby tested a different question with even more dramatic results. Proposition A, teach only Darwin's theory of evolution and the scientific evidence that supports it, which is what's done in the school. Is this appropriate? 14% across the nation agreed. On the other hand, teach Darwin's theory of evolution, but also the scientific evidence against it. 78% agreed. We're not as dumb as we think we are sometimes. And then 2012, Gallup poll tested the proposition that it is taught in the school, man evolved by natural processes, and that's taught in all of the biology texts across the country. 15% of the country believed in it. Now, why does 15% prevail? 78% has to shut up. And that's because we allow it. And we shouldn't. It's time to object about that. It's interesting to notice that we see this movement spreading across the world, even in Europe. Here, this appeared, this is very current, February 15th, 2015. Scientists warn creationism on the rise in Europe. More and more people in Europe are beginning to believe that a God, not evolution, shaped life over a 5-year study. They're losing the battle. And scientists are beginning to stand up and speak out. Several years ago, 2001, 100 scientists took out an ad in the New Republic stating that they doubted that Darwinian evolution could explain what we see in the biological world, and signed their names. And these are 100 scientists from the leading institutions across the country: the American Museum of Natural Science, the Smithsonian Institution from Harvard. Since then, over 800 scientists have joined, and all of these have doctorates in the natural sciences, including scientists from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Russian, Polish, Czech national academies, from such universities as Yale and Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Columbia, Berkeley, UCLA, Duke, Cambridge, Oxford, yes, Indiana University, Indiana State, Purdue, Ball State, Notre Dame, have professors that have signed this statement that Darwinism does not explain what we're seeing in the world. In spite of this, we still have statements like Ernst Mayr of Harvard made, perhaps one of the most famous evolutionists in our country. No educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be a simple lie. I'm sorry, it's a simple lie. I know he knows better, but this is what he tells his students, and many of them believe it. We have debated the subject on college campus, and I think we just beat the tar out of them. That's my view. They quit debating. They don't do that anymore. Here we see Eugenia Scott writing in New Scientist, advising scientists should refuse formal debates because they do more harm than good. Well, you know, from her perspective, they do. She's had experience with that. at LSU, the head of the geology department there. He'd been scheduled for about 6 months. Big auditorium in the middle of the campus. Over 500 students showed up and filled up 400 seats and then some. And the professor didn't show. So I won. I spoke for about an hour, Q&A for another hour. Interestingly, the Campus Crusade put on this debate, handed out cards as they came in. And 54% of them believed in creation, according to that survey. 2 weeks later, they followed up. 2 weeks later, 94% of them believed in creation. But to teach him not to show up. But yes, they refuse formal debates. This is their advice. But scientists still need to counter it. But you don't counter it when they have an opportunity to answer. You do it behind their backs. And how do you do it? Well, Richard Dawkins on his website gives advice about how you do this. He says, you have to learn to go beyond humorous ridicule. Sharpen our barbs to a point where they really hurt. I think they're likely to be swayed by a display of reason and logic. No, by naked contempt. Nobody likes to be laughed at. Nobody wants to be the butt of contempt. And so, this is the way you win it. Now, this is not my description of his conduct. This is his description of how evolutionists ought to treat creationists. Why they don't have debates anymore. You really hurt your barbs with naked contempt. It's interesting to contrast that with Darwin's view as expressed in Origin of Species. He says a fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question. Does that make sense? I think that's the way it ought to be. I was presenting a lecture like this at a university up in Canada, and one of the professors says, you're not being fair. You only give us 15 minutes to answer questions, and you're speaking for 30 minutes. I said, well, I sure appreciate your sense of fairness. And, of course, I understand this is the way you do it in your classroom. You give equal time. And, of course, the kids laughed at him. He didn't believe in equal time, or didn't even want me speaking for 1 week while he had the whole year, which was fair enough. That was fine with me. I think this is a fair way to do it, and we want to give you a chance to respond. And we're going to take a break at this point, see if some of you have some questions, and as we suggested, you don't have to agree. But we'd be glad to attempt to answer your questions. We have some on here.
Can I ask you, all these years of geology, archaeology, who paid your salary at that time? You all in the world. Somebody must have income.
I was earning income as a geologist and sometimes as an archaeologist.
Who paid you?
I was an independent consultant. I was paid by the ones I worked with.
Who?
Well, in some instances, we were working for oil concerns, and sometimes it was actually a gold mine. My wife has a good job. That helped a lot. She paid a lot of the salary, and I certainly appreciate that. I also preach, and
Your teacher from a Christianity creation standpoint. You realize that Christianity is only 1/3 of the world. 2/3 of the world do not believe in Christianity. You aware of that? I should have said.
I don't think counting those
variation of Christianity
has anything to do with truth. In New Testament times, there were a whole lot less than that. There were about 12.
thousands of religions in the world.
And
Europe, about 70% believe in evolution.
what does that have to do with truth? Counting noses is not the
All
right
facts. This is all facts.
That's what he's presented.
You can count noses if you want, but I don't think that leads to truth. The great majority of all is wrong. And we've learned that in the study of Yes, sir.
I just wondered if you were aware of the irreducible complexity of the bacterial flagellum that Behe put forth, if you were aware that that argument had already been refuted, and that there is an explanation in the all moving parts, they have been removed, and it still functions. They have actually found, you can look it up.
I have looked it up. I'm very well aware.
I would urge everybody to look it up.
Foolish
There is an
attempts.
explanation for the bacterial flagellum.
You've asked the question, and now then I'll respond.
It's not irreducibly complex. The parts
that
can
is
be,
true.
can be broken down and can still function.
You're asserting that it isn't. I'm asserting it is.
I'm saying, look
and
it
I
up.
think it's a good idea to look it up and to read that. There is a presentation of both sides of that on the Discovery Institute website, and you can see what he is saying and why, and the professors that presented, as well as the argument for. And look at the evidence on both sides and see. But the statement that it's not irreducibly complex, I deny, and I think that will stand.
You can deny it, but people can look
The
it up.
the
and see
argument
if you're wrong.
goes like this, and you've got 30 parts to account for. They've tried to account for 3 that arose in a different setting and then came to be appropriated by the bacterial flagellum. The analogy is like this. Now, it wasn't the same thing, but it was similar, and therefore, since it existed, at least in a similar form in another organism, it could be appropriated then by the flagellum. The analogy would be like this. Here's a sports car that is highly tuned, and it's flying down the highway, and it runs past the apartment building and vibrates a radio that's sitting up here on the windowsill, and it falls out and lands in the dashboard and now works perfectly in the sports car. That is a very simplistic simile comparison. The organisms are much more complex than the radio and the sports car. But parts that are somewhat similar over here don't just happen to fit and begin to work efficiently any more than a radio would fall off and fall into the dashboard and begin to function. That's the kind of argument that has been offered. And I'm sorry, it's foolish. And to say that proves that irreducible complexity has been answered is not completely honest.
Are you a biological scientist?
I'm a geologist.
You're a geologist.
But I have very good friends who are very good
Oh,
geologists.
doctor, that, may I ask?
I'm sorry, yours?
Where's your doctor at? What
The Pacific School of Graduate Studies in Australia. But I studied geology at Purdue, Indiana University, Pui, and Austin Peay.
Are these accredited schools?
Do we have other questions? Yes.
I'm confused. I was wanting to know what you guys believe. Like, you believe Jesus died on the cross, and
I'm sorry.
I'm not gonna stand because I'm teaching my daughter. But
I'm having difficulty hearing.
I wanted to know what you guys believed. I understand I kind of feel like you're just telling me a bunch of guys who don't believe in God.
What we believe.
But you believe in Jesus died on the cross and everything in the Bible?
I do, but that's not our subject. Our subject is scientific evidence, and that's what we're talking about. I preached at the church here in Kokomo on Sunday, and we talked about religious things. There are many people who don't believe the Bible, sometimes because they have been misled and told things that aren't true. And so we examine the evidence just from science with those who don't accept the Scriptures. And I think that's an appropriate place to start. I think that's what Paul did on Mars Hill. He started with the philosophies and the quotations from their poets. In Acts 2, he could start with David and Job. So we start where people are. That's what we do in education. And begin from that point. But this week here in this auditorium, we're going to be talking about the scientific evidence and what's the best explanation for origins from the science.
I'm an obstetrician, gynecologist. I deliver babies, And there's no other explanation for the birth of a human being. But I'm also a farmer, and one of the things that I see is if there's a field that's chaotic, it doesn't automatically become ordered. Nothing in nature goes from chaotic to order without some type of design. There's no logical flow there. It starts
We
chaotic.
appreciate your point, and we're going to be talking about that subject later in the week. But we're asking for questions at this point.
Well,
Even if you agree with us.
I'm going to ask you about the
Yes.
order of the chaos.
That's, we'll be talking about that tomorrow evening. That is the second law of thermodynamics. Then we'll look at Bible says. All right, let's move on to the second session. If you have further questions, we'll be glad to entertain them then. With any discussion, especially when we have opposing views, it's very important to define our terms, because many times we disagree without disagreeing. We're just talking about different things. And that happens a great deal on this end. I'm going to allow G.A. Kirkland to define what I believe is a very important distinction when we're defining evolution. In his book, Implications of Evolution, he is an evolutionist. He said, there's a theory which states that many living animals can be observed over the course of time to undergo changes so that new species are formed. You can see things that are changes that are called new species. A cow gets a little longer horn, it gets an extra spot or extra spots. I think it's horizontal variation, it's still a cow. But there are some things. What is a species? Very nebulous term. Theodosius Stajansky says it's whatever a good taxonomist says a species is. Bacteria becomes resistant to penicillin. We'll talk more about that later. That's a new species. But if I'm resistant and you're not, we're not different species. It's very inconsistently applied. But it is true that there are things we can see that vary, I think horizontally, changes that are called species that we can observe. This can be called a special theory of evolution. He's defining this special theory as what I would call horizontal variation. It's changes that we do see. That can be demonstrated in certain cases. I think one of the best illustrations would be the dogs. They interbreed, but they look very different. If you find them in the fossil record, you might say these are different kinds, but they're not. They do interbreed, even foxes and wolves. I think this is horizontal variation within the kind and can be demonstrated. But that's not what we're talking about. Notice, Kirkland continues, on the other hand, there's a theory that all the living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form. This can be called the general theory of evolution. Now, this is where it's at. This is the issue, not variation within the kind, horizontal variation, but a change from one kind to another kind, from a common ancestor. You begin with one kind, you go to a totally different kind, and then to another kind. This is what we're talking about, and that's seldom talked about, unfortunately. They want to talk about what we do observe, which is horizontal variation, but they don't want to talk about what they don't observe, which is the change from one kind to another kind. We need to understand where the issue is. I was speaking one time, and one of the professors said, Dr. Patton, don't you believe in change? Evolution is just change. And I said, well, yes, I've got some in my mind, but I think we need to define our terms better if we're going to have a good conversation. The scientific method is how you determine what is established scientifically and what isn't. It's not just who hollers the loudest or who has the greatest poll numbers. We're winning here, they're winning there. Does that change true? No, not at all. The scientific method is stated in the textbooks. Scientists understand it's seldom followed, unfortunately. People are just as competitive and just as ambitious and sometimes dishonest, as has been reported recently in the journals, fudging research results maybe 60% of the time. But this is the way it's supposed to work. We're dealing with things that are observable, that are repeatable, that we can experiment with, thus repeat, not just me, others repeat what I do, and vice versa. And it must be falsifiable. These are the 4 criteria. The 4th is probably the least familiar to the general audience. Basically, it involves testability. You have to be able to set up a test so that if this happens, it's verified. If this happens, it's falsified. If everything you do fits, that's not good, because you can't potentially falsify. There's no way to test it. It's just a tautology. And that may be the most important criteria. But we have to deal with things that we can see in the test. The interior of the sun we can guess about, but you can't observe that. We create models, and we'll talk about that later. How does this apply to the general theory of evolution? Not talking about your special. Well, in the living world, can we observe the change from one kind to another kind? Notice the statement by G. Leonard Stebbins, one of the more famous evolutionists in the world, from Harvard. He says, the reason the major steps of evolution have never been observed is that they require millions of years. Okay, if that's the case, then you would see them, but then the point is, the first criteria is observation, and he's saying, no, you can't do that. Though he may have a reasonable explanation, it still can't be done. But you're supposed to be able to observe over millions of years in the fossil record. Can we observe changes there? We'll be talking more about that Friday evening, but just as a preview, notice the statement by the famous evolutionist Stephen Gould from Harvard. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontologists. We view our data as so bad, we never see the very process we profess to study. No, it's not seen in the living world, because it takes too long. It's not seen in the fossil record. His view is because of punctuated equilibrium, which basically says it went so fast you didn't see it. In the fossil record, it goes too fast. In the living world, it goes too slow. But in either case, you don't see it, which fails that first criteria. Then what about experimentation and repeatability? Let's notice the statement by Ernst Mayr of Harvard, a very famous evolutionist. Evolutionary biology, in contrast with physics and chemistry, is a historical science. Now, a lot of people don't understand that difference. Bill Nye, the science guy, showed his ignorance on that point and just denied this, which Ernst Mayr, perhaps the most authoritative evolutionist in our country, is affirming. He says the evolutionist attempts to explain events and processes that have already taken place. The Australopithecus evolved into the man, but can you repeat that? Now, this is historical. Laws and experiments are inappropriate techniques. Experiments you can't experiment with historical processes. And I think that's very important to see. You can't repeat, you can't experiment. And what about falsifiability? Colin Patterson was curator of the British Museum of Natural History, the largest fossil museum in the world. And he comments on the testability or falsifiability of the general view of evolution. He said it's unique and unrepeatable, like the history of England. Unique events are by definition not a part of science, for they are unrepeatable and not subject to test. You can't do that with history. That's a different process. And so, at all 4 points, you see the general theory of evolution fails very obviously. And people that say, well, it's proved scientifically, either don't know what it means to prove something scientifically, or they're not telling the truth, because they haven't seen that change from one kind to another kind, and they can't repeat that in an experiment, and it's not testable. Now, at the same time, isn't this also true about creation? we can't repeat this and experiment with it. Maybe we could set up some falsifiable ideas, and maybe we could, some aspects of evolution are falsifiable, and we'll see some of that later. But generally speaking, I think that neither meet these criteria. Neither are subject to what we would call scientific proof. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not subject to science, but not the scientific method which provides proof. Both evolution and creation can be investigated scientifically, and we've illustrated that with creation as we began. But the proper method to use with those processes that you don't observe, or you can't experiment with, or potentially falsify, is model comparison. You look at the world around you, and you see that which you can observe in biology, and microbiology, physics, and geology, and paleontology, and you see which model is served best by the evidence, which fits the data best with the fewest secondary and tertiary assumptions. Sometimes called the principle of Occam's razor, or the principle of parsimony. You can make any model fit with enough secondary and tertiary assumptions, but the one that fits with the fewest and just most directly is the one most likely. Now, this is not proof. It's a probabilistic statement, but it's the way you proceed when you can't prove it scientifically. And it's a scientific method. Now, Darwin traveled around the world as the ship's naturalist and saw and observed facts and based conclusions on those facts. What model is served best by what he saw? Let's consider the evidence that convinced Darwin that evolution was the best explanation for it. We see him traveling to the Galapagos Islands, and there aboard the Beagle saw some pretty unusual animals that we hadn't seen in England. And thought that was intriguing. How did this come to be? It was a question that arose in his mind, and especially as he looked at the finches, he could see maybe a reasonable explanation, because the finches with the little pointy beaks lived in the islands with trees where they could reach in and get the insects and bark. But the ones with the big, thick, heavy beaks lived on the islands without the trees, where they were eating seeds and making a living in a different way. Did they change? Were they, well, how did that come to be? His assumption was it developed over a long period of time. It naturally selected the bigger beak or the larger beak. But we're looking at special evolution. They're still finches. They're not eagles. They're not becoming anything different. They're still finches, without question, just adapted. The creationist would say that the Creator would put within each kind the capacity to adapt to different circumstances. And what we've learned just in the last 10 years about epigenetics, the epigenome, is that environmental factors do influence. And the epigenome controls the DNA, turns factors on and turns them off, and sometimes triggered by the environment, which we didn't know just a very short time ago. And so maybe some of those environmental factors are triggered, but they still remain the same kind. But you see the variation within the kind. The beak shapes on the different islands were different. This is not evidence for one kind to another kind. He saw no evidence of that at all. But it's really interesting to see what's claimed from this kind of evidence. Here recently, reporting on the work that's been done for the last 20 years by two very good, competent scientists, reported in Live Science. Finches evolved before scientists' eyes. The byline says, for the first time, scientists have observed in real time evolutionary changes in one species driven by competition for resources. Now this sounds like evidence for what Darwin was talking about. And there was a drought, and you see things changed. The smaller beaks, the relative numbers did change. They admit the shrinkage that they're talking about, this evolution, was a shrinkage in the beak size with the drought, was less than 1 millimeter. And then they admit that, well, this wasn't really new. There were many of them that had exactly this same beak before the drought, but now then there are more of them during the drought. And guess what? When the drought was over, it went back. It didn't accumulate. Only the relative numbers changed. There was nothing new at all. But finches evolved before scientists' eyes is the headline. Now, I submit that's just deceit. We know what the kids think when they read that. They read the fine print, maybe, and maybe they don't. More information has come to light just recently, 2014, reported in Nature. Wow, this speciation, 14 different species that Darwin found, has been undone. The finches have collapsed under conditions of hybridization into 2. He says, oh, over time they evolved into 13. Now then, we only have 2. Wow. Well, that's what happens. They go this way and they go that way, but they do not accumulate. It's reversible, horizontal variation. That's not general evolution. That's not change from one kind to another kind. It's not even close. As we look at what Darwin did observe, I think it's important to consider what he didn't observe as well. He didn't observe a kelp or a bird dog. And we look at that and we say, that's silly, that's not going to happen. And of course, that's why it's comical, isn't it? No. Because we know that what we know happens is the little finches get little bigger beaks and little smaller beaks, and it goes back and forth. This is funny. I mean, this just, wow. We know better. And the reason we laugh is because we know that ain't going to happen. What we do see is the kind of thing Darwin saw that does not prove general evolution at all. He saw horizontal variation within the kind, like we observe in the living world, and that's not what we're talking about. And this is the same point that we see illustrated with the peppered moths, that are all of the biology textbooks. Before the Industrial Revolution, the light-colored bark camouflaged the light-colored moths. And the black ones stuck out, and so which ones do you think were getting hit by the birds? Ones that weren't camouflaged to each other. And the story was somewhat contrived, but this is the way the story is written in the books. After the Industrial Revolution, soot covered the trees. Now then, you've got more of the light-colored ones sticking out, and they get eaten. There are fewer of them in the world, and now then more black. But you've got light ones and dark ones before, and you've got light ones and dark ones after. Just difference, again, in relative numbers. It was interesting that Harrison Matthews was given the great honor of writing the introduction to the centennial edition of Origin of the Species. Perhaps the most famous biologist in England. And in that introduction, he says, the peppered moth experiments, which Darwin relied on, do not show evolution in progress. For however the population may alter, the moths remain from beginning to end, Listed Bachelora, same species. Light and dark before, light and dark. And here's the fellow who is the champion, writing the introduction to the 100-year edition of Darwin. And this is what he says in his introduction. It should have been said a long time ago. This is not supportive evolution. And yet we read in International Wildlife Encyclopedia, this is the most striking evolutionary change ever witnessed by man. I think they may be right. That's as good as it gets. But it's certainly not general evolution. Furthermore, what we've learned more recently discredits even the poor case that had been made. Jerry Cohen, who is one of the most vicious anti-creationists, ardent evolutionist in the country, University of Chicago, He's writing in Nature and refers to Majerus, who has done more work with the peppered moths in England. He notes the most serious problem in Viston bacillera probably does not rest on tree trunks. Yeah, that would be a problem, wouldn't it? I've seen thousands of them on tree trunks in the textbooks. That's the argument. But they don't rest on tree trunks. Exactly 2 moths have been seen in such a position in more than 40 years of research. How did they get on tree? Well, they glued them on tree trunks to take the pictures. That is deceit. But it's still being taught. It's still in the textbooks. And here in Science 2011, the peppered moth, Viston bacillera, is one of the most widely recognized examples of contemporary evolutionary change. What it is a shift in the relative numbers of pre-existing horizontal variations. That's not helpful for general evolution. And while we're talking about these small variations that Darwin saw and promoted as evidence of proof of evolution, general evolution, let me add another thing that fits into that category that Darwin didn't talk about. But it fits here since it's a similar argument. I'm just going to shoehorn it in at this point. Everybody's heard about the evolved antibiotic resistance. You don't want to take too many antibiotics because this will evolve a resistant form. And we see former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton fairly recently in the New York Times making this argument, I believe in evolution. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria is evidence that evolution is going on as we speak. You can understand that it looks that way, but that is not what's happening. And we should have known this for some time. Notice the statement in the Medical Tribune. This was back in '88, though it hadn't been reported earlier. And this came from the discovery of people found frozen up in the Antarctic from an 1845 expedition. And the article says it may be time to rethink our thoughts about the mechanisms for antibiotic resistance patterns. Bacteria from the bowels of 3 members of an 1845 Arctic expedition have survived 140 years and are showing resistance patterns to modern antibiotics. Now, wait a minute. This is way before antibiotics, isn't it? And there's plenty of resistant form before the antibiotics. Current theory suggests that antibiotic resistance is linked to long-term exposure to antibiotics. Needless to say, antibiotics were not developed long after these 19th century bacteria and their hosts had been buried in the Arctic permafrost. The resistant form did not evolve because it was exposed to antibiotics. It was already there. An even more dramatic example of that was reported last year in Science. Petrified human feces from the 14th century. I'm not going to show you a picture of this. It was surprising that the ancient stool had more, talking about antibiotic-resistant genes, than the modern. 14th century. Not only did it have the antibiotic resistance, it had more than we got, caused by antibiotics. I don't think so. That's not what's going on. And if we don't know what's going on, we're probably not going to be able to handle it very well. Let me illustrate it this way. Here's the tummy that's sick. It's got the bad bacteria that's causing the rumbly tummy. And it also includes the recessive form of the resistance that's already there and was documented there in the 14th century. But it's not the dominant form. Well, here comes the antibiotics and wipes out the normal form. Now, what have we got left? The resistant form which takes over. We've got evolution. No, you've got less information than you had before. You had 2 types, now you just got 1. What has evolved? Nothing has evolved. And if we don't understand that, we'll never get sick. What we do see with antibiotics is an amazing ability to adapt, which appears to be a programmed variation that doesn't accumulate but that goes this way and that way. Bacteria can't go over to the thermostat and say, it's too hot in here, I'm going to turn it down. They have to adapt, and they do amazingly, and then they adapt right back when the circumstances change. But we do not observe accumulating change in the bacteria. That's just a lie that's being told, and it's not so, and we'll document that further before we finish. What Darwin observed was small changes, like in the finches. Though he didn't see change, he assumed that it came about, and I think he was probably right. He didn't observe the big changes, but he assumed that the small changes would add up to the big ones that we couldn't see. Didn't see it, but assumed it. Now that's the big question. He assumed the thing to be proved, and I will assert that that assumption has been tested, and that it has been falsified. No, you can't do that, it takes millions of years. Well, but not always. There are some things that we can observe in terms of millions of generations that reproduce rapidly so that we can see if the little changes add up to the big ones. Like with the fruit flies that can reproduce a new generation like every 2 weeks. And we've done terrible things to these fruit flies in the college classroom. We irradiate them and we put mutagenic chemicals in there, and they come out with no wings and curly wings and no eyes. And it's a wonder PETA hasn't gotten involved with terrible treatment of these fruit flies. But guess what we got now? We got fruit flies. After millions of generations observed in the classroom since the early 1900s, reproducing sometimes up to every 2 weeks. And we see this with bacteria even more dramatically, reproducing like every 20 minutes. And what we've got is the same kind that we observed 300 years ago, the same basic kinds. Notice Michael Dussault, writing in the Encyclopedia of Life Sciences, saying, if mutations were a variation of value in the species, then the evolution of Drosophila should have proceeded with extreme rapidity. One of the highest mutation rates of any organism, which is why you use it in the classroom, see the mutations. Okay, if this is going to benefit, boy, we ought to see some benefit. Yet the facts entirely contradict the validity of this theoretical deduction. We have seen the Drosophila type has not been modified in any way. We see them way back in the fossil record. They look just like they do today. Reproducing up to every 2 weeks, millions of generations observed. Now, it takes too long to get this many generations. Not really. And this has been observed. We watched it closely in the classroom. With bacteria, you see the same point being made. Again, from Warner Vaughan in his book, Bacterial Genetics, one of the leading authorities in the field. It says, despite the rapid rate of propagation, the enormous size of attainable populations, changes within initially homogeneous bacterial populations apparently do not progress beyond certain boundaries. We see change this way, we see change that way, but boom, it hits a brick wall. And it does not go further. We see boundaries, according to this leading authority. Now, I like to work with fossils in the rocks. This is where we get real documentation, and here we see exactly what I said before when I said these bacteria do not progress. February 3rd, 2015, I believe that's up to date. Pictures of fossil bacteria compared with live bacteria today. Here from Fizzor. Bacteria look the same as bacteria of the same region 2.3 billion years ago. Now, I don't buy those dates for reasons we'll talk about, I believe, Wednesday evening. Scientific evidence. We hope you'll come back and hear that. But let's play the game their way to see how it comes out. Billions of years for organisms that reproduce up to every 20 minutes. Billions of years. And it's exactly the same. And that both sets of ancient bacteria are indistinguishable from modern sulfur bacteria, which is what we're looking at here. Why do you believe that it's going to add up? You see that it doesn't. You see variation, but you see boundaries. And we can test this assumption that Darwin did not see, that the big ones, the little ones will add up to the big ones. When we do test it and can, then we see it falls flat on its face. We see things like organisms in the amber that are preserved, we're told, for millions of years. Here, reported National Geographic, 365 animal inclusions trapped in tiny drops of ancient amber. 245 to 280 million years old, surprisingly, to them. These microscopic organisms are quite familiar to today's scientists. They've undergone few or no physical changes. Look just like the critters we got today. When you can test, and there are times when you can test, it's falsified. The assumption that the little ones add up to the big ones. Many of the leading scientists are beginning to be honest enough to acknowledge that. But what we're talking about is not just the observation that's described in the textbook. There are two observations. We see variation. I think it's horizontal. It's not the kind of variation that the evolutionist predicts. They're all degrading complexity. Sometimes a switch breaks. Maybe sometimes the switch breaking can help in some circumstances, but it's a degradation. Harmful or neutral in the normal environment. A few are a little limited in usefulness, like you're less complex and you lose your eyes in the cave. Maybe that's an advantage down in the cave, but losing your eyes is degrading complexity. Some are cyclical. They change with the environment. None are unlimited and cumulative in their effect, leading to novel organs. So, yes, we see variation, but it's not the kind that they're looking for. But variation, okay. That's not all we see. In addition, we see variation boundaries. When tested, demonstrate that. But you're not allowed to look at the boundaries. Don't talk about the boundaries, just talk about the variation. But that's not good science. Good science requires that we look at all of the evidence. And it's beginning to sink in. And we see people beginning to acknowledge this basic assumption of Darwin. The little ones add up to the big ones. See the little ones, can't see the big ones, but we assume that's what happens. Francisco Elliot, who was one of the key figures as acknowledged here in science, in propounding the modern synthesis. That's the idea that's taught in the textbooks today. Synthesizing Darwin's theory of natural selection with Mendel's populations, genetics, and dynamics, putting those together, Mendelian genetics and Darwinian selection, you get the modern theory of evolution, the modern synthesis. He's the one that wrote it. He's the main prime mover. Reported back, this is back in 1980 when he said this. Small changes do not accumulate. We see this from fossil record, we see this from observation in the living world. It doesn't happen. Stephen Gould, again, a leader in the field, working especially in the fossil record, says, I've been watching it slowly unravel, talking about the modern synthesis, the story that's taught in the textbook. I've been watching it slowly unravel as a universal description of evolution. I've been reluctant to admit it since beguiling is often forever, but that theory, as a general proposition, is effectively dead, despite its persistence as textbook orthodoxy. Still in your textbooks. They don't have anything to replace it. But it doesn't work. We can test it. It falls on its face, and the leading authorities are telling us this, but what do we put in the textbooks? Until we get something that supports our view, we just keep saying what we've been saying, even though the leaders are saying it's not so. All right, this was 1980. Google maybe is somewhat dated. Here is probably the leading authority today, Eugene Kuhn, the National Center for Biotechnology and Information with the Evolutionary Genomics Research Group. Probably the leading authority today. In his book, Trends in Genetics, he refers to the general theories of evolution that's taught in the textbooks. He says they're gone. In terms of scientific validity, the traditional concept of the tree of life, gone. Natural selection, the main driving force of evolution, that's gone. You, of course, knew that, right? No. But the leading authorities have been telling us that. The modern synthesis has crumbled, apparently beyond repair. This is not an evolutionist. Not a creationist. He's a devout evolutionist. The leader. The modern synthesis, what's taught in the textbooks, has crumbled, apparently beyond repair. Not to mince words, the modern synthesis is gone, but not from the textbooks. Now, that's what we're looking at in the living world. We talked about how you evaluate what you don't see. Change in the general sense, one kind and another kind. And what Darwin looked at, and when we look at the world around us, we see a lot of things. Which model is served best? We see basically two observations. We see variation, which a creationist predicts. The creator would put within each kind the capacity to adapt, to survive in different circumstances. Now then, we've learned that the epigenome may trigger some of these adaptations, like brown rabbits in Texas and white rabbits in the Arctic. But still rabbits. We see variation. We predict that. We also see boundaries. When we can test, there are brick walls at the edges of the boundaries. Evolution would predict that there would be variation, but as we pointed out, they predict a different type of variation. But if they see what they would expect to see, it would still be half of the explanation. They don't explain the boundaries and can't. When you look at the boundaries and you see that the little ones don't add up, that kills the concept. According to their own authorities, it's dead or gone, according to Kuhn. Which is the better model? Which one fits best? This is the way you do science. This is what creation science is. You look at the evidence. We're not talking about Genesis. This is not a Bible study. We're talking about the empirical evidence and comparing the best evidence that Darwin had and what we're seeing today and the arguments that are made and acknowledging what the leading evolutionists have acknowledged. Which one is the better model? That's what creation science is. Now, if you're thinking that the purpose tonight was to convince you that one model is better, okay, maybe you were convinced. But that really wasn't what we were doing tonight. What we're doing tonight is getting you to see what creation science is, in contrast to the lies you see in the media. It is about science, about the empirical evidence, and how to proceed scientifically and determine, not by screaming at each other, but by scientific evidence, which model is served best by the evidence. That's what it is. Now, as we proceed through the week, we're going to be showing, I think, overwhelming evidence that I believe will persuade an honest person, and I think we've seen some of it tonight, but you haven't seen anything yet. All right, we're going to take a break at this point and see if some of you have some questions.
I'd like to ask you,
Yes, sir.
Yeah.